6 drown within minutes, pulled under by wounds or engulfed by burning fuel. 19 remain, scattered across the waves, watching their home disappear beneath the surface. They have no idea that for the next 29 days, the ocean itself will hunt them. By the time this nightmare ends, only one will be found alive, washed onto a remote island near the mouth of the Amazon, delirious, skeletal, barely clinging to existence. This is the story of the submarine Archimeda and her crew, a tale of survival that pushes the human body and spirit to absolute breaking point. If this kind of deep dive into history is what you're looking for, take a moment to subscribe and drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from today. The Archimede was not a German U-boat in the traditional sense. She was Italian, a Brin-class submarine displacing 1,100 tons, built at the Cantiere Navale Franco Tosi shipyard in Taranto, and commissioned in January 1939. But by 1943, the distinction between Italian and German submarine operations had become almost academic. Italy's submarines operated out of Batisum, the Italian submarine base in Bordeaux, occupied France, working in coordination with Admiral Karl Dönitz's U-boat command. They shared intelligence, patrol zones, and a common enemy. The waters off Brazil had become a killing ground, and the Archimede was heading directly into it. Her commander was Tenente di Vascello Guido Saccardo, a Neapolitan officer just 29 years old. He had volunteered for submarine duty after growing frustrated with the tedium of escort work aboard destroyers in the Mediterranean. His previous vessel, the destroyer Lanciera, had done little more than shepherd convoys back and forth. Saccardo craved action. He completed the submarine commander's course at Pola and traveled overland to Bordeaux, where he assumed command of the Archimede in the late summer of 1942. He was kind, popular with his crew, easygoing to a fault. But experience was something he lacked. This would prove fatal. The Archimede had already lived several lives before Saccardo took command. Her early years were spent operating out of Massawa, the Italian naval base in East Africa, conducting routine patrols in the Red Sea. When British forces began closing in on Italian East Africa in early 1941, the submarine command ordered 4 boats to attempt the long, perilous voyage around the Cape of Good Hope to reach Bordeaux. The Archimede was among them. It was an odyssey of over 12,700 miles, most of it on the surface, through waters where any Allied aircraft or warship could spell doom. She arrived in France after 65 days at sea, her crew exhausted but alive. From Bordeaux, she would conduct patrol after patrol into the Atlantic, hunting Allied shipping. One of her previous commanders was Tenente di Vascello Gianfranco Gazzana Priaroggia, a Milanese officer who would become the most successful Italian submarine commander of the war by tonnage sunk. Under Gazzana, the Archimede had seen real combat, including a controversial claimed attack on an American cruiser and the confirmed sinking of a 6,000-ton freighter. But Gazzana moved on to other commands, and when Saccardo arrived, the boat's best days were behind her. Her crew even called her Una Carcassa, an old hulk. Her crash dive time, once a sharp 36 seconds to reach 15 meters, had degraded to nearly a minute. In the South Atlantic of 1943, where Allied aircraft now prowled with increasing frequency and effectiveness, a minute was an eternity. February 14, 1943. The Archimede slipped her moorings at Bordeaux alongside 2 sister boats, the Leonardo da Vinci and the Bagnolini. Their mission, a 4-month patrol in the waters off Brazil, targeting the merchant traffic that fed the Allied war machine. The crew had just received communion from the base chaplain. According to the sole survivor's later testimony, the men sensed something dark awaiting them. As they said goodbye to the priest, one exclaimed, "We shall not see each other again. We are going to our death." Motor trouble forced the Archimede to return to port almost immediately. She set out again the following day, escorted through the dangerous waters of the Bay of Biscay by German minesweepers, destroyers, and aircraft. For 6 days and nights, she alternated between surfacing at night to charge her batteries and diving during daylight hours to avoid the prowling eyes of Royal Air Force Coastal Command. Once clear of the danger zone, she headed southwest across the Atlantic. It took her roughly 25 days to reach her patrol area, a triangular zone stretching from Pernambuco to St. Paul Rocks and northwestward into the open Atlantic. For weeks, the patrol was uneventful. The crew settled into the grinding routine of submarine life: 4-hour watches, cramped quarters, stale air, endless vigilance. They sighted a few neutral ships, Argentinian and Spanish vessels, but no legitimate targets. Around midnight on April 14th, they glimpsed the lighthouse at Fernando de Noronha, a Brazilian island roughly 350 kilometers off the coast. They continued toward St. Paul Rocks, surfaced, making perhaps 5 to 7 knots. Then came April 15th. The afternoon sun hung low on the horizon. Scattered clouds dotted the sky. Visibility stretched 10 miles or more. At 15:10 hours local time, lookouts aboard a United States Navy PBY-5A Catalina flying patrol out of Natal, Brazil, spotted a dark shape on the water's surface. Range, 8 miles. Heading, directly opposite to the aircraft. The submarine was fully surfaced, making no attempt to dive. The plane's pilot held his course and altitude, watching, waiting, determining his approach angle. Aboard the Archimede, the executive officer's voice crackled over the intercom. Plane sighted, dead ahead. Commander Sicardo immediately ordered the crew to battle stations and to secure all watertight doors. Men scrambled to their posts. Giuseppe Lococo, a 26-year-old Sottocapo Nostromo, a coxswain third class, ran from the aft torpedo compartment to his position at the forward deck gun. The gunnery officer, Sottotenente di Vascello Tommaso Magnani, stood nearby with his arms folded, giving no orders. He had been a merchant marine navigation officer before being drafted into the submarine service. He admitted openly that he knew nothing about gunnery. Now, as an American bomber bore down on them, he simply muttered that he hoped they would submerge soon and get out of this mess. But the Archimede could not submerge. Something had gone wrong with her systems, a technical difficulty of unspecified nature that left her unable to dive. Perhaps it was the aging machinery. Perhaps it was a failure in the diving tanks or the horizontal rudder mechanism. Whatever the cause, Sicardo had no choice but to fight on the surface. The crew manned the guns, a 100-millimeter deck gun forward, a 37-millimeter machine gun on the aft conning tower, and smaller automatic weapons. They opened fire as the Catalina began its run. The first plane's pilot, Ensign T.E. Robertson of Patrol Squadron 83, made his initial pass without releasing ordnance. He was evaluating the situation, determining the submarine's course and speed, positioning for a better attack angle. The crew of the Archimede watched, tense, as the aircraft circled away. Some dared to hope they might escape. Then the Catalina turned back, descending rapidly from 6,000 feet, diving at an angle of perhaps 60 degrees. Robertson released 4 Mark 44 depth bombs at around 2,000 feet. 2 exploded close aboard the submarine's port side, roughly 20 feet aft of the conning tower. 2 more detonated to starboard, about 60 feet forward. The concussions were tremendous. Columns of water erupted skyward, drenching the deck, cascading down through open hatches. The forward hatchway covers were ripped from their hinges. One of the diesel engines went dead. The lighting system shattered, plunging compartments into darkness. And, critically, with the forward hatches destroyed, the Archimede could no longer dive even if her systems had been functional. She was trapped on the surface, wounded, bleeding oil in a long brown slick, circling because she could no longer steer properly to starboard. The Catalina climbed away to radio for assistance. For 45 agonizing minutes, the Archimede limped along on the surface. Dark gray smoke billowed from the conning tower. Her speed dropped to 4 or 5 knots. The forward deck gun fired sporadically at the circling aircraft, 10 rounds in 40 minutes. But the shells found no target. The crew could only wait, knowing that another attack was inevitable. At around 1600 hours, a second PBY-5A Catalina arrived, piloted by Lieutenant G. Bradford, Jr. This aircraft came in low at just 1,500 feet, spotting the submarine clearly, fully surfaced but down at the stern, her aft deck already awash. Bradford circled to position for a stern attack, approaching from a target angle of roughly 210 degrees. At 1,500 yards, both the plane and the submarine opened fire simultaneously. The machine gun mounted on the aft conning tower barked steadily, 2 rounds per second, tracers arcing toward the incoming bomber. Bradford held his course. At 50 to 100 feet altitude, he released 4 Mark 44 depth bombs set for 25-foot depth detonation. The bombs walked across the submarine's stern. 3 exploded along the port quarter, bracketing the hull just aft of the conning tower. The 4th struck the starboard deck itself. 1 bomb tore through the aft hatchway, and a sheet of flame erupted from the fuel oil pooled in the bilges below. Even worse, the 4 prime torpedoes, still loaded in the aft tubes, detonated in a catastrophic secondary explosion. The blast ripped a massive hole in the pressure hull. The aft torpedo compartment tore loose from the rest of the boat, hanging, as Lococo later described it, like a broken arm. Seawater rushed into the shattered hull. The Archimede began to sink, stern first, her bow rising higher and higher until it stood nearly 50 degrees out of the water, pointing at the sky like an accusing finger. Inside the doomed submarine, chaos reigned. The order came to abandon ship, but not everyone obeyed, and not everyone was given the chance. The chief engineer, Capitano Direzione Macchine Lorenzo Ferrari, held many of the crew below at gunpoint. A Neapolitan, 33 years old, fiercely loyal, and fanatically committed to going down with the boat, Ferrari declared that if their submarine sank, they would die with her. Because of him, according to Lococo's later testimony, roughly 35 crew members never made it out of the hull. 25 men managed to escape into the water. Commander Saccardo was among them, calm and resigned, encouraging the survivors and trying to keep them together. The gunnery officer Magnani jumped clear. Executive officer Zuliani made it out, though he would later blame Saccardo for the disaster. Lococo himself escaped, his body peppered with small metal fragments from the explosions. 6 of the 25 died within minutes, drowned by their wounds or swallowed by the slick of burning fuel that spread across the waves. The machine gunner on the starboard side of the conning tower, a sottocapo motorista named Botero, kept firing until the water reached his neck. Even as the boat sank beneath him, he continued sending rounds toward the circling aircraft. He was badly wounded in one leg and died shortly after being hauled aboard one of the life rafts. At 16:25 hours, the Archimede slid beneath the surface for the last time. A large burst of bubbles marked her final moment. A slick of brown oil, perhaps 200 feet long and 25 feet wide, spread in a semicircle over her grave. No debris floated to the surface. Just men, perhaps 30 or 40 of them, scattered across the waves, 1/3 wearing Kapok life preservers or escape lungs. The American aircraft made several more passes. 3 7-man rubber rafts were dropped close to the survivors. The crewmen began pulling themselves into the rafts, grouping together, salvaging what scraps of hope they could from the disaster. The plane circled until fuel ran low, then departed, radioing the position of the survivors to base. A search flight the following day found nothing. The rafts and the men aboard them had vanished into the vast emptiness of the South Atlantic. If you're finding this story gripping, now would be a good time to leave a like and subscribe. Your support helps bring more stories like this one to light. According to Giuseppe Lococo's later account, only 2 of the 3 rafts were successfully manned. 13 survivors crowded into one raft, 6 boarded another. The rest were scattered beyond reach, left to drift alone or in small groups without flotation. Their fates were sealed within hours or days, taken by exhaustion, wounds, or sharks. The 2 rafts stayed together initially. Commander Sicardo took charge, organizing the men, rationing what little food and water they had, which was almost nothing. The rubber rafts came equipped with minimal survival kits, perhaps some water, some emergency rations, basic fishing gear. For 60 men accustomed to the relative comfort of a submarine, even one as cramped and primitive as the Archimede, the rafts offered almost nothing. There was no shelter from the equatorial sun, which beat down mercilessly during the day. There was no protection from the cold that crept in at night. There was no privacy, no dignity, and soon no hope. The currents of the South Atlantic are governed by the great oceanic gyres, vast circular patterns of water movement driven by wind and the rotation of the earth. Off the coast of Brazil, the South Equatorial Current pushes steadily westward toward the bulge of the continent before splitting, part flowing northward along the coast and part curving southward. The survivors aboard the rafts were caught in this current, carried slowly, inexorably, toward the northwest, toward the mouth of the Amazon River, thousands of miles away. Days passed. The sun rose and set. The men weakened. Water was the most critical shortage. A human being can survive perhaps 3 weeks without food, but only 3 to 5 days without water in normal conditions. In the tropics, under the blazing sun, with no shade and salt spray constantly evaporating from sun-damaged skin, dehydration accelerates dramatically. The men's lips cracked, their tongues swelled. Their urine turned dark, then stopped altogether. Some began drinking seawater, which only hastened their deaths, as the salt pulled water from their cells and poisoned their kidneys. Food ran out quickly. Some men tried to fish, but the equipment was inadequate and their strength was failing. Occasionally, flying fish would land in the rafts, providing a few mouthfuls of raw protein. It was never enough. Starvation began to hollow out their bodies, consuming first the fat reserves, then the muscle tissue, then the organs themselves. The men's cheeks sank, their ribs protruded, their eyes grew dull and unfocused. Disease struck. In the unsanitary conditions of the rafts, with wounds festering and immune systems collapsing, infections spread rapidly. Men developed fevers, hallucinations, delirium. The executive officer, Zuliani, became feverish and incoherent, ranting about the commander's incompetence, blaming Sicardo for everything. Others simply grew quieter and quieter, withdrawing into themselves, conserving what little energy remained for the simple act of breathing. One by one, they began to die. Some slipped away in their sleep, their bodies finally surrendering to dehydration and exhaustion. Others succumbed to their wounds, infections spreading unchecked through their weakened systems. A few may have made the choice to end their own suffering, slipping quietly over the side into the shark-infested waters. The survivors lacked the strength to bury the dead properly. Bodies were rolled over the side, left to sink or float, food for the fish that circled constantly beneath the rafts. The 2 rafts drifted apart at some point during the ordeal. What happened to the larger raft with its 13 occupants remains unknown. None of them were ever found. Perhaps they succumbed to the same grim calculus of dehydration and starvation. Perhaps they were capsized by a storm or attacked by sharks. Perhaps they simply drifted in a different direction, carried by capricious currents to some unmarked grave in the open ocean. Their fate is one of the many unanswered questions left by this tragedy. The smaller raft, with its original 6 occupants, fared only marginally better. By the time it approached land, nearly a month after the sinking, only 3 men remained alive. 2 of them were already dead or dying when Brazilian fishermen spotted the raft on May 27, 1943, 29 days after the Archimede went down. The raft had washed up near the island of Baleek, a low-lying mangrove-covered island near the western shore of the Amazon River Delta. It was not a major shipping lane or a populated coastline. It was remote, isolated, the kind of place where a small rubber raft could easily go unnoticed for days. But local fishermen, indigenous people who knew these waters intimately, spotted the strange object and paddled out to investigate. What they found was almost unrecognizable as human. 3 bodies lay in the raft. 2 were clearly dead, their skin sun-blackened, their bodies wasted beyond recognition. The 3rd was barely alive, delirious, unable to speak coherently, his body a skeletal frame draped in salt-crusted rags. This was Giuseppe Lococo. The fishermen transported him to the nearby island of Brieg, where they nursed him with whatever resources their small community could provide: fresh water, food, shade. Days passed before Lococo recovered enough to communicate, and even then his speech was confused, fragmented. Eventually, the natives realized that this strange, broken man was not Brazilian, not Portuguese, not anything they had encountered before. He was speaking Italian. Word reached the Brazilian naval authorities in Belém, the major city at the mouth of the Amazon. A gunboat was dispatched to retrieve the survivor. On June 6, 1943, 52 days after the Archimede sank, Lococo arrived in Belém, still weak, still traumatized, but alive. He was the only one. The Brazilian Naval Command held him incommunicado at their base, recognizing the intelligence value of a captured enemy submariner. He was then transferred by air to the United States, arriving at an interrogation center on June 27th. American naval intelligence officers debriefed him extensively over the following weeks, producing a detailed report on the Archimede, her crew, her capabilities, and her final mission. Lococo proved cooperative. He was anti-fascist, he said, and despised the Germans. He was a Sicilian from a working-class background, conscripted in 1938, with only 3 years of elementary schooling. He had joined the Archimede in January 1939 and had served aboard her for 4 years, through all her voyages, the patrols out of Massawa, the epic journey around Africa to Bordeaux, the hunting cruises in the Atlantic. He had seen commanders come and go, watched his boat deteriorate from a capable weapon of war into the old hulk that finally went down off Brazil. His testimony painted a vivid picture of life aboard an Italian submarine, the camaraderie among the crew, whom he described as having a fine family spirit, the friction between popular officers like Saccardo and unpopular ones like Zuliani, the cramped conditions, the constant repairs, the sense of fatalism that pervaded long patrols into enemy-controlled waters, and finally, the horror of that last day, the bombs falling, the explosions ripping the hull apart, the chief engineer holding men at gunpoint to die with the ship, the desperate swim to the rafts, the endless days adrift, watching friends die one by one. The American intelligence officers noted that his memory for dates and technical details was limited. Perhaps, they speculated, affected by his 29-day ordeal. But his account of the sinking was consistent with the aerial action reports. The Archimede was confirmed destroyed. All search efforts for other survivors had failed. Lococo was the only one. The fate of the Archimede's crew was not unique. The submarine war in the Atlantic was a grinding, attritional conflict that consumed men and machines at a horrifying rate. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served in the German U-boat arm during the war, approximately 30,000 were killed, a casualty rate of 75%. The Italian submarine service suffered similarly. Of the boats that operated out of Baitasum during the war, a significant proportion were lost to enemy action, accidents, or the simple perils of the sea. But few losses were as drawn out, as agonizing, as the death of the Archimede's survivors. Most submarine crews died quickly, crushed by depth charges, drowned when their boats sank, incinerated by fires or explosions. The men of the Archimede were given the cruelest gift survival, followed by a slow, tortuous death under the open sky, surrounded by more water than they could ever drink, and yet dying of thirst. Giuseppe Lococo spent the rest of the war in an American prisoner of war camp. He was treated well by standards of the time, adequate food, shelter, medical care. The war ended in 1945. Italy had switched sides by then, becoming a co-belligerent with the Allies after Mussolini's overthrow in 1943. Lococo was eventually repatriated to his homeland, to a Sicily devastated by years of conflict and economic hardship. What became of him after that is unclear. The historical record so detailed about his ordeal at sea and his interrogation in captivity falls silent on his post-war life. Perhaps he returned to his family, married, raised children, lived out a quiet existence far from the ocean that had nearly claimed him. Perhaps he carried the trauma of those 29 days for the rest of his life, haunted by the faces of the men who died beside him. Perhaps, like so many veterans of that terrible war, he simply tried to forget, to bury the memories in the daily routines of civilian life. The wreck of the Archimede lies somewhere off the coast of Brazil in roughly 3 degrees, 23 minutes south latitude and 30 degrees, 28 minutes west longitude, according to the action reports. The depth in that area ranges from several hundred to several thousand meters. No expedition has ever recovered the wreck or the remains of the crew. They rest where they fell more than 80 years ago, entombed in the steel hull that was their home, their weapon, and, finally, their coffin. The story of the Archimede is a reminder of the human cost of submarine warfare, a form of combat that stripped away the traditional distinctions between combatants and rendered men utterly vulnerable to the elements. A surface ship damaged in battle might limp into port for repairs. Her crew might be rescued by passing vessels or swim to shore. A submarine offered no such mercies. Once breached, she sank. Once sunk, her crew's options were death or drift, and drift usually meant death by slower means. It is also a reminder of the particular brutality of the South Atlantic theater, often overshadowed in popular memory by the more famous campaigns in the North Atlantic. The waters off Brazil were just as deadly, patrolled by American and Brazilian aircraft that grew more effective as the war progressed. The U-boats and Italian submarines that hunted there faced increasingly long odds, and many never returned. The Archimede was one of them. The sole survivor, Giuseppe Lococo, stands as both witness and warning. His testimony preserved the memory of 60 men who would otherwise be forgotten, their names reduced to a single line in a casualty list. Through his words, recorded by American interrogators in that summer of 1943, we know that Commander Sicardo stayed calm until the end, that Votero kept firing his machine gun until the water swallowed him, that Ferrari died with his ship and took 35 men with him, that Zuliani blamed everyone but himself, that the priest was right. They never did see each other again. The ocean keeps its secrets. Somewhere beneath the waves, the Archimede still rests, slowly corroding, slowly returning to the seabed from which her steel was forged. And somewhere in the currents of the South Atlantic, the memory of 19 men drifts still, carried by the same waters that carried them toward a shore most would never reach. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it moved you, if it taught you something, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing this video with someone who appreciates history. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Where are you watching from today? What other forgotten stories of the Second World War would you like to see explored? The ocean is vast, and history is full of ships that never came home. Until next time. 16:25 hours, April 15, 1943. The bow of an Italian submarine rises from the South Atlantic at a terrifying angle, almost 50 degrees, like a steel whale gasping for its final breath. Flames lick the conning tower. Oil spreads across the water in a dark, viscous slick, and then slowly, inevitably, the stern slides backward into the depths, dragging 59 men with it. 25 managed to escape.